people joining, you can then let them in.
Yep,
And as
we'll
soon
do,
as
and I just press record, so we're good.
Okay, great. All right, welcome everyone. This is Caroline Stem. I am the coordinator for the Conservation Measures Partnership. I've also been the lead on coordinating and organizing the CMP More Learning Initiative. Sarah Weber, who's also here, has been kind of the lead on helping to set up and run these webinars. So it's been great to have her doing that and to have all the people that were part of this learning initiative sharing their results with the rest of the conservation standards community. So thank you all for joining. This has been a really great opportunity to take learning that's happened over the last year or two and get it out there to a broader audience. Maybe just a little bit about this series or the initiative itself. This is an initiative under the Conservation Measures Partnership. It has received for the last 2 years and for this coming year, it has received generous support from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And the aim behind the series is trying to create or foster collaboration across different conservation organizations and groups to look at different strategies that the conservation community is using and trying to understand the conditions under which they tend to be successful or not. What are some of the barriers, the hurdles, the enabling conditions that need to be present? And so each year there have been anywhere from 4 to 8 priority topics that CMP and More have identified together. And then there's been a group of people, a team that have gone off and structured how they kind of defined better the questions and structured how they were going to go about answering them and learning. And so now we're at the stage of sharing with you all the results from the efforts that have been conducted in 2020, and in some cases, including this one, going back even to 2019. So this is, there are several different webinars that we've had over the past 3 months or so, 2-3 months. They are available on our YouTube channel. I'm going to put the YouTube link in the chat box right now. So if you want to go back and look at any of the previous ones, or if you want to listen to this one again, you can go there. We also encourage you to share these with your colleagues, both within and outside of your organization. We want to get this learning into as many hands as possible. And also to mention, we've got another session coming up on April 26th about thinking and working politically. And I'm going to put the link to the registration for that in case you are interested in the chat box as well. And maybe one final point, we've really enjoyed having these webinar series and they've been really well attended. And so CMP is looking to continue them. They won't be necessarily on the or limited to the collaborative learning initiative themselves, but we hope to kind of keep this this process of sharing and learning and getting feedback from the broader community on this work. So I just invite you all to keep your eyes open for emails that will be coming through about that. And also if you've got a particular topic that you would really like to share, maybe reach out to Sarah or me, and I will put our emails in the chat box now. And then I think, unless Sarah Weber or anybody else has anything to say, I'd probably turn it over to Sarah Mason from Duke.
All right, well, if no one else is going to take the mic, then I'll go ahead.
Great, thank you.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks very much for coming. I'm here today actually with two others who will be joining the presentation in just a few minutes to share findings from a project that examined how external financing and COVID have influenced National Protected Area funding. This project was initiated last year as a partnership between Duke University and Wildlife Conservation Society with support from the Moore Foundation. And the bulk of the research carried out was actually done by a group of both graduate and undergraduate students at Duke University, two of whom are on the line today to help share results. So Jawalan Patel and Mariana Vedovedo will be, again, joining me in just a few minutes. The project team was guided by members from each of the partner organizations. So my name is Sarah Mason, and I'm representing the team from Duke. And I also just want to send a special thank you to Paulina Arroyo from the Moore Foundation and David Wilkie from WCS, who were really instrumental to this work. So this was really a two-part inquiry. It started by asking, how does external financing from places like foundations, multilaterals, or nonprofits influence funding commitments by national governments to protected areas? So when we say external financing, we're talking about, funding external to a particular government. And the question was really aimed at trying to figure out, does this external financing inspire in-country support, or does it actually perhaps inadvertently pave the way for governments to divert internal funding away from protected areas that are being funded through other means? And then in the midst of doing this research for that first question, the pandemic hit, which inspired our second, but somewhat related question that has, I'm sure, been on a lot of people's minds over the past year, which is, how has COVID-19 and sort of the associated fallout influenced national commitments to protected areas? So to answer these questions, we, and when I say we, it was really the team of students, did a series of interviews with protected area experts from around the world and constructed country profiles to better contextualize results. I won't dwell on this piece too long because I want to kind of get to our findings, but in total, we did 25 interviews representing 3 global regions, Asia Pacific, Africa, and Latin America. And I'll just jump right into what we found. So going to that first question, which is, how has external funding influenced internal spending on protected areas? We unsurprisingly got a variety of answers. So when we asked this question, does external financing influence internal spending on protected areas? Some interviewees said no, and their response either fell into one of two categories if their answer was no. The first reason, the first sort of category of answers, was that the government has other priorities and would really be unlikely to spend money on protected areas regardless of whether external finance is flowing in. And the second reason that people noted was that the government of the country really just doesn't tend to accept external funding for protected areas, in which case there's obviously not going to be any effect. The majority of our interview respondents did say that external finance had an influence on internal spending. For those who said that this external funding had a negative effect, the reason was given that when protected areas receive external money, the government then chooses to divert resources elsewhere, which was kind of the fear that inspired part of this research question. However, many people actually said that external finance has a positive influence on internal spending. So for those who noted that, they said it was for one of 4 reasons. It fell into sort of these 4 categories. The first being that there were stipulations built into the funding mechanism that prevent governments from diverting funds. Second, that external funding influences political will positively to invest in PA or protected areas. So seeing international money come in for protected areas then inspires politicians to spend more to promote those areas to attract future funding. The third sort of bucket of answers was that external funding increases protected area capacity, which in turn gives the protected areas capability to lobby for additional internal funds. And finally, the last reason that people gave was that external funding can actually lead to innovations, which also positively sort of incentivize governments to invest in those effectively managed protected areas. So this graphic, I will say, is a very sort of quick overview summary of a much larger report. And if anyone is interested in sort of the nitty-gritty details, I'd be happy to share that. It's also available online, so I can share the link to that at the end of the presentation. But for now, I'm going to pass things off to Mariana and Joellen, who will get into a summary of the findings from our interviews focused on the question of how COVID has influenced protected area funding.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm Mariana, and I will be presenting some findings from the interviews we conducted with experts in 2020. And these are key points we want to emphasize today. Our respondents pointed to a decrease in the availability of funding due to COVID. Some are concerned about the particularities of private conservation areas. There are others suggested some promising funding mechanisms that could help create more funding sustainability for protected areas. We also discussed the importance of transparency when it comes to financing protected areas, and also the importance of existing relationships for coping with a period of crisis. Next, please. I will now go back to the first point I mentioned. And interviewers think that funding for protected areas will mostly decline this year. During our interviews, 30% of respondents mentioned that in terms of government budget, they hadn't really seen meaningful changes, but this is mainly due to timing. Budgeting usually happens the year before, right? So the impact of COVID hadn't affected government budgets in 2020, but the respondents expect that it could potentially be more noticeable this year. 70% of our respondents, they saw either a modest or a substantial budget change. And this is mainly due the impact on tourism. So because of COVID, we know that tourism has dropped a lot, and it has affected mainly protected areas that rely on the revenue from tourism. And here on this slide, we just have some quotes from Peru, Bolivia, and Latin America more in general that support what I just said. Next slide, please. So regarding private conservation areas, this is something interesting that some interviewees mentioned because this is a particular case because these areas are pretty much rely on tourism, and they rarely have access to government funding. So they have suffered the most with COVID-19. And these areas also don't have any kind of other clear sources of funding and seem to be unassisted, except for some NGOs that end up supporting these private areas through grants. But yeah, it's still a challenge because interviewees couldn't really offer a solution for the case of private conservation areas. Maybe that could be any sort of fund that is focused on them, or any sort of loans, but they also emphasize that although they might be smaller areas, they are still very important when we think of connectivity and the sustainability of the landscape. Next, please. And when we look at more resilient funding mechanisms, our respondents, they suggested some attractive options based on their experience and their experience of other countries. All respondents stressed the importance of diversifying funding sources, and these are some examples that we heard. So that for nature swap, many interviewees mentioned, especially because of COVID, that countries will probably being that, or they will need some money to recover, and why not condition this on investments in nature, right? So some pointed to that option. Another mechanisms would be the project finance for permanence, which has been a model mainly. I mean, it has been explored in many countries, but Latin American has been trying to make progress with this mechanism. I don't know if everyone is familiar with that, but it's basically like a fund that will hold back funding until a target amount and the disbursement milestones are reached. And it's really interesting because these mechanism really tries to bring together everyone that is working on a particular area. And the idea is just to have a holistic approach and combine rigorous financial plans, project finance, but also match collaboration between governments, NGOs, public and private funders. So they coordinate their action and their funding, plus combined with a political commitment to a conservation goal. So this has been an innovative approach that many countries are pursuing. So interviewers also mentioned this as a potential promising mechanism. Others talk about innovating tourism as well, and maybe try to attract more domestic tourists instead of relying so much on international travelers, or also maybe have a specific, like a niche for tourism, some sort of adventurous tourism to attract more young folks. And another interesting point that actually many interviewees mentioned was this develop and nurture new relationships. So many mentioned that it would be interesting to bring more private funding to protected areas through different channels, right? Either from corporate social responsibility or any sort of compensation mechanism, green bonds, impact investing, or even through greening supply chains as a way of attracting this stakeholder and in order to diversify funding for protected areas. I think Joalin will continue presenting our findings.
Hi everyone, nice to meet you all. So just going off of what Mariana was talking about in terms of the importance of relationships, while it was difficult to say which particular relationships were most important or helpful because of the diversity of park funding structures we find across countries, multiple respondents mentioned the importance of existing relationships between parks and multilateral funding organizations prior to the pandemic. Parks that already had working relationships built on trust found it easier to access emergency funds during the pandemic. Respondents mentioned trust and the importance of continued nurturing of relationships with international and multilateral funding organizations. So in Bolivia, WWF sent funds to support park expenses during COVID. Our interview also mentioned funds contributed by local actors such as FCBC and SPDA, and support also came from NGOs like WCS to provide COVID protection materials for local communities and park guards, etc. So in Africa, on the other hand, the US Fish and Wildlife Service did not give out a single grant this year, but groups with good pre-existing relationships with organizations like USAID, EU, KFW, our interviewees mentioned that they were in better positions to weather the COVID crises because these relationships granted them more flexibility to allocate funds during times of crises. One important thing that we found was that multiple respondents spoke about increased integration of local communities into parks management. In Africa, our interviewee mentioned that conservation is very expensive in remote areas, especially where there are expats on the payroll. Therefore, there's more need to support locals from the host country to effectively develop capacity and build resilience for situations that like the pandemic and more that could come in the future. For Bolivia, interviewee indicated that parks with directors and managers with good relationships with local stakeholders were in a better position to protect PAs during the crises. And so did we hear similar stories from Peru, where they mentioned that it was critical to prioritize involvement with local actors to increase peer resilience. Next slide, please. So the pandemic also brought to light the importance of transparency in funding for protected areas. Multiple respondents indicated that with reduced funds during the pandemic, there was an interest in increasing transparency around how parks are managed and park funds are managed. In many instances, it has been unclear in the past how funds are being distributed, where they're going towards, making it difficult to think about future funding for park networks and how that could be distributed more efficiently. In Latin America, per se, one of our interviewees pointed out flaws that they encountered in practice, such as NGO funding not necessarily being connected to PA plans, and usually being more short-term solutions, and then big organizations such as multilateral organizations not having cost-effective disbursement structures to distribute small amounts of funds, which could have been used to better respond time sensitively to crises like COVID. So there was an overall desire for better fund disbursement and mobilization within parks and park management. An interviewee spoke from Africa. An interviewee from Africa spoke about how important NGO support is in Africa, and that NGOs have been trying to drum up support and fill gaps left by government funding and shortages in tourism. But there wasn't much clarity specifically on governments cutting back funding, particularly in Africa, where many parks are severely underfunded even before going into the pandemic. So what is to note that government, park, and NGO revenues from tourism collapsed completely, and any foreign revenue from photographic hunting, tourism disappeared in a time where parks were already quite underfunded. So there was a concern. There is still a concern that whether the funding will recover to pre-COVID levels for Africa, and in particular where our interviewee heard about illegal poaching and activities taking place during the pandemic. In general, many countries haven't been able to foster the financial autonomy for parks. There's poor quality of spending, as many parks are not cost effective, and poor management of resources in terms of transparency and efficiency. So more funding might not always be effective if governments and designated park management are unable to manage those funds effectively. So all in all, for these 2 points in terms of transparency and existing relationships, the pandemic re-emphasized the importance of social networks and local support to build park resilience.
Right. So before we wrap up, I do want to acknowledge other work that's been going on and that has been done to address this question of how the pandemic has affected protected areas and their funding. You may all be familiar with this, but there was a special issue of Parks that came out just last month on COVID and conserved areas that focused on many of these very issues that we heard about in our interviews. And I just wanted to sort of summarize what reinforced what we heard, and then a little bit of what was unique in the parks issue and unique to what we found. Much of what is contained in this special issue reinforces what we heard in our interviews. So namely that almost all protected areas have seen some kind of negative financial impact from COVID. I think that's not surprising. And this has most affected staffing, enforcement, and monitoring. However, most protected areas have continued to function at some capacity, but like we heard, there really is this ongoing fear of future budget cuts related to the economic fallout from the pandemic. And also external threats to protected areas have only increased since the pandemic's onset, making those future lack of funds even more critical. One unique item that came up in the parks issue that we didn't really hear about in our interviews was really the significance of protected areas' reduced capacity to engage directly in person with local communities, either because of staffing cuts or lockdown restrictions. And there's really a concern about the effect that might have, given the importance of engagement with people who live around the park or who care about the park. On the other hand, unique to our findings were those points that Joellen just shared a few moments ago, those issues of transparency and the importance of existing relationships when searching for emergency funds or searching for ways to sort of maintain park upkeep while the pandemic is going on. So we didn't really see either of those points explicitly raised in the articles in this special issue. And with that, if my PowerPoint will go forward, we can take some time for questions. Like I mentioned before, we do have summary reports that provide some more details. So I can drop those links into the chat for those that are available online. The report that summarizes the COVID interviews is not online, but you can reach out to me if you'd like more details on that one.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, Mariana, and Joellen. That was great. Really interesting work you've got here, very relevant, very contextually relevant. So let's take some time now. If people have questions, maybe because we've got so many of us on the call, you could either raise your hand or put your name in the chat box and we'll call on you. Okay, Will, looks like Will Beal has a question.
Hello, sorry, yeah, I do have a quick question. So just going back, thank you very much for the presentation. Going back to that graph, I think David at the time said that was a great summary of the different responses. And I just wondered if you had could give any sense of the relative proportions of the different responses, or whether the majority said yes, external funding makes a difference, or they said no, or well, yeah, maybe it's worth turning to it. Or whether it's in particular situations that I know that there were one or two examples mentioned, but could you express or characterize what sort of situations you get the various responses from?
Yes, I'm not going to give exact numbers because I don't have them on hand, but I know that it was more than half of our respondents, I think somewhere around 60 or 70% said yes, that external financing does influence internal spending. I know that this negative response here, I'm pretty sure that was only one country that we talked to. And for these positive responses, I know that there were multiple people multiple respondents who fit into this first category on stipulations, and multiple people who fell into this external funding influenced political will. I think it was just one or two who had these second two. If you're interested in the exact numbers, I can sort of dig up those numbers and share them with you. I do also want to emphasize, this represents 15 interviews, so it's not going to be a completely comprehensive global summary, but we were able to sort of categorize these different outcomes.
Yeah, fine. No, that's fine. It's just helpful to get a rough idea. I would be, if you are able to share a bit more detail on it, that would be great. Thanks.
Sure.
If I can just add a little more. So for no, that external finance does not influence. It was out of the 15 interviews, it was 2 of our interviews, 2 countries, which was India and Nepal and Thailand, where the government does not really accept or have funding interactions with nonprofits or multilateral organizations being involved in like the park budgets or playing any significant role. But we saw a lot of examples from Africa for NGO involvement that had stipulations built into external funding mechanisms to encourage the local government to take interest in funding and financing the park. So just to give you an overview.
Thank you.
All right. Great. That was a great question, Will. Thank you. How about others? Anyone else want to ask a question, either in the chat
We
box?
have one in the chat
Oh, great.
from Matt
Thank you.
Mayer.
I missed it.
Yeah, no problem. What information is available on conservation outcomes and the mix of internal / external financing?
Yeah, so we do have more details on that in the full report. So we talk about we got a sense from our interviewees on the effectiveness of the different protected areas that they were either overseeing or funding, and the sort of intersection between that and the either internal or external financing. So I dropped that link in the chat. The external finance report does have some more details on that for the different sort of country representatives that we interviewed for that first piece of our research.
And Sarah Weber, when we follow up with the recording, we'll also provide links to these materials, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great.
I have a question. Thank you all for the presentation. This is Paulina. And even though I've seen this a few times, I always get something more out of it. So thank you. I was really curious on that one slide about transparency, because I know in several countries that is a big issue right now, especially with COVID and unfortunately increased corruption, just even managing the health crisis. But it's interesting to see then in the protected areas realm and sector how transparency is important and how it's impacted. I don't know if you could say a little bit more about that, the transparency of the governance.
I think I'm a little bit confused with what exactly you're trying to ask. I'm sorry.
Could you go to that slide?
Yeah, I think we can go back to the slide. Are you talking about the 2 red highlighted? Oh, I'm sorry. No.
Yeah, well, this one, yeah, it was the importance of transparency. And it's one noticed we must be very transparent because it's key for success. I was just wondering if you had more information or thoughts or comments that you received during the interviews about the point of transparency.
Based on what we heard from the interviewees, I think the notion of transparency was more about having, for example, here with PFP, having being clear on the goals set for conservation outcomes, and then linking the funding to those specific goals and being specific and clear. Even in terms of attracting investment, and when you speak of a broader scale on governance, that transparency does translate in the sense that with parks and networks where we don't have really good idea of how these funds are trickling down to activities on the ground, it becomes very difficult to even think of long-term sustainable financing for these parks. So I think that was something that the pandemic sort of exacerbated, and it would be hard to imagine that such parks didn't have a hard time dealing with funding.
And I remember there was at least one person who was saying, you know, as we're trying to sort of scramble to put together funds because of the sort of the crisis that emerged after the pandemic, you know, they said, we don't even know where most of our funding is coming from, you know, that it's so opaque that we don't even know who really to talk to or you know, where to go to try to open up those funding streams even a little bit, because we just don't have that information. And I'm seeing a question about why we selected the countries we did. We selected them to try to get a spread across sort of major global regions. So we ended up with Asia Pacific, Africa, and Latin America. I will say that most of the time, the reason we selected the countries is because people responded to our inquiries and were willing to be interviewed. So we had a much larger list to begin with, and then had to narrow it down based on who responded, especially during COVID. You know, people were stretched pretty thin, and so it was difficult to get in touch with people.
Well, it's impressive how many people you were able to talk to, how many different countries. Let's see, are there any other questions?
Caroline, I just want to say that given how challenging the circumstances were when this project started up, I think the Duke team did just an amazing job. As soon as COVID hit and we all got locked down and things, all field staff were dealing with such a huge array of challenges. It's just remarkable that the students were able to interview anybody. And so I actually think that the sample size is amazing for how challenging it was.
Agreed. All right, there's some thank yous in the chat box for the great presentation. Maybe just one more call for any other questions or comments. All right, I'm not seeing any. Just want to share another huge thank you to the Duke team. This is really great, really interesting, and appreciate you sharing your findings with the community. And also a thank you to the Moore Foundation for supporting these really important learning initiatives. It's really been exciting to see the conservation standards community sharing, learning, really kind of doing what we set out to do many years ago when we all first started working together. So thank you. All right, everybody. Sarah Weber will be following up with links to the recording from this presentation and some key resources. And again, I would, there's a chat, Renee sent, put a chat in there, GF project. So people can click on that. And yeah, we'll be following up with a link to the recording and other key resources associated with this. And then maybe just one more, I'll again put in the YouTube channel here and a link to the next registration for the Thinking and Working Politically series. So that's coming in just a second here.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay,
Stay
great.
safe.
Thank you, everyone. Have a
Great.
great
Thanks
rest of
very
the
much.
day.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
You.
Bye.